When my daughter called me a burden, she didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even lower her voice. "We can't keep sacrificing our lives for you," she said, sitting across from me at my own dining table. "This isn't sustainable." I was 64 years old, and apparently my existence had become unsustainable. 5 years earlier, I had slipped in the hallway of my house. There was no dramatic music, no thunderstorm outside, no tragic buildup. Just a loose rug and one careless step. The crack of bone against tile is a sound you never forget. The surgery saved my mobility, but recovery took something else. It took control. For the first time in my life, I needed help to stand. And needing help is a dangerous thing when the people around you have forgotten who you used to be. I had been a nurse for 32 years. Emergency rooms, oncology, palliative care. I had held hands while people took their last breaths. I had told families the truth when doctors couldn't find the words. I worked nights while my children slept. I worked holidays so they could open presents. After my husband died suddenly from a stroke at 52, I didn't have the luxury of collapsing. I had 2 teenagers, college tuition, a mortgage. Grief became a private activity. Strength became a public performance. When I fractured my hip, my children stepped in. At first, Daniel handled paperwork. Marissa organized medication schedules. But slowly something shifted. Compassion turned into coordination. Coordination turned into inconvenience. I overheard more than they realized. "She's not the same anymore," Marissa whispered one night. Daniel responded, "We can't keep pausing our lives." Pausing. As if I had pressed a button on their futures. 3 months later, they arrived together. That should have warned me. They sat across from me like consultants presenting a proposal. Daniel had numbers. Marissa had brochures. "We've found a very reputable assisted living facility," she said gently. Gently. Like I was already fragile glass. "I can still cook," I said. "You almost dropped boiling water last week," Daniel countered. "I was dizzy from medication." That's exactly the point. The conversation wasn't about my health. It was about their discomfort. They didn't want to watch me age. They didn't want to rearrange their lives around unpredictability. And perhaps worst of all, they didn't want to imagine becoming me someday. The day they moved me out of my house was the day something inside me broke. Not my heart. My illusion. I had believed unconditional love meant permanence. I was wrong. Love, apparently, came with conditions. Mobility. Independence. Utility. The assisted living facility was clean. Neutral. Emotionally sterile. Pêche-walls. Soft lighting. The faint scent of antiseptic and resignation. The first week, I cried every night. The second week, I stopped crying. Not because it hurt less, but because I realized tears weren't a strategy. That's when I met Eleanor Whitmore, 82, former CEO of a regional healthcare investment group. Sharp tongue, sharper mind. She watched me help another resident adjust her oxygen tubing and said, "You're not done." Done with what? I asked bitterly. With being relevant. It was the first time in months someone spoke to me like I was still capable. The facility had problems. Understaffed shifts. Medication timing inconsistencies. Poor communication between management and caregivers. I noticed patterns instinctively. One afternoon, a resident nearly received a double dosage of insulin. I intervened. The director called me into her office. "Old habits," I said calmly. Instead of reprimanding me, she asked questions. By the end of the week, I was unofficially advising. By the end of the month, I was consulting. Within 6 months, I was restructuring workflow systems. Turns out experience doesn't disappear. It waits. Meanwhile, my children called less. When they did, it was brief. "How are you feeling?" "Good." That was enough for them. On my 65th birthday, they sent flowers. No visit. The card said, "Hope you're settling in." Settling in. Like I was luggage. Eleanor and I grew close. Not out of loneliness. Out of alignment. She had built a healthcare investment portfolio decades earlier and still held majority shares in several facilities, including ours. I built it because I saw what neglect does, she told me. And what does it do? I asked. It rots dignity. She began bringing me financial reports, asking my opinion, testing my instincts. One evening she asked, "If you ran this company, what would you change?" I answered without hesitation. Staff-to-resident ratios, training incentives, transparent reporting, family accountability systems. She smiled. Good. You're thinking long-term. When Eleanor passed away quietly in her sleep 6 months later, I felt grief, but also responsibility. Her attorney called me in. She had left me her controlling interest in the Senior Care Corporation. My children had no idea. I barely did. But the paperwork was real. So were the assets. The next 3 years were relentless. Board meetings, legal training, operational audits. Some executives underestimated me immediately. "She's a retired nurse," one whispered during a meeting. I heard him. I didn't respond. Instead, I replaced him 6 months later. Not emotionally. Strategically. I implemented transparency systems that exposed years of inefficiency. Some managers resigned. Others adapted. Families began noticing improvements. Occupancy rates increased. Investor confidence grew. Within 4 years, the company doubled in valuation. We expanded to 6 states. I no longer lived in a beige room. I lived in a modest lakefront home I purchased outright. Not extravagant. Intentional. Then came the downturn. Daniel's tech company collapsed after a failed acquisition. Marissa's husband was laid off during a corporate merger. Their mortgage payments ballooned. Savings evaporated. And for the first time in years, they called not out of obligation, but desperation. When they stood outside my new home, they looked older than I remembered. Worried. Smaller. "Mom," Daniel said quietly. That word carried weight again. They explained everything. Debt. Pressure. Fear. I listened without interruption. 5 years earlier, they had analyzed me like a liability. Now they were the ones presenting spreadsheets of vulnerability. "Can you help us?" Marissa whispered. I could have said no. I could have reminded them of brochures and beige walls. But revenge is loud. And I had learned something during those years. Power doesn't need to shout. I helped. But not blindly. Daniel joined our corporate compliance team. Entry level. He hated it at first. Then he learned humility. Marissa managed community outreach programs. She met families who were afraid of becoming burdens. It changed her. Slowly. One afternoon, Daniel sat across from me in my office. Not at my dining table. My office. "I thought independence meant never needing anyone," he admitted. "It means being strong enough to admit when you do," I replied. He nodded. "I was afraid of watching you age," he confessed. "That fear isn't my fault," I said gently. He understood. Finally. 5 years ago, they moved me out because I reminded them of fragility. Today, they work in an organization built on my resilience. They see residents differently now. They see aging differently. They see me differently. I was never useless. I was inconvenient. And there's a difference. One fades. The other forces growth. Sometimes the people you set aside as fragile are simply being repositioned. 5 years ago, they left me in a beige room. Today, they stand when I enter the boardroom. Not because I demand it, but because they finally understand. Strength doesn't disappear with age. It concentrates. And sometimes, the woman you thought was declining is simply preparing to lead.